Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on documentation. Now, to get things started, I want to talk to you about why documentation is so important. And why do I want to do that? Well, let's be real. Who likes doing documentation? I know I don't. I mean, that's almost like busy work, right? So if we have to do this almost mundane task that we don't like doing, there better be a good reason. So there's a few of them that I'll share with you now. I'm sure there's many more, but I'll go over just a few. The first one that I'd like to mention is training. And really, training I could divide almost into like two different reasons, right? You have training A, which is training your users, which I think would be an easier task if you have how things work very well documented, and then you can create that training from it. I mean, as an instructor, that is something that I go through on a regular basis. When I want to figure out how to train someone else how to do something, it's always a lot easier when I have good, solid documentation right here in front of me. This is how it works. So from that, I can create a lesson plan. But training B, if you want to call it that, right, the other kind of training, and this is where I really think documentation is way more important, is the training of new network administrators. If you bring somebody new into the organization who's going to be helping you to run the network, I will tell you that that whole process is exponentially easier when there's good documentation that that administrator can reference when trying to learn how to do his or her job. Okay, and I can tell you from personal experience, I've worked for small companies where, it was pretty much me. I was the guy. I was the network administrator. But then the company grew, and I had to bring in somebody else. So I put together what I thought was some good training for this new employee, only to realize that you can't put that together. There's just so many different things that happen on a daily basis that what happens is that new network administrator had to come and ask me on a daily basis for many weeks, maybe even into months, well, how does this work? Or where do I find that? All right, so training to me, and maybe it's because I'm an instructor, that's a really important reason to have good documentation. Now, another reason is troubleshooting. Okay, when it comes to troubleshooting, here's the deal. You sit down, you have a problem, and you go through a series of troubleshooting steps to try to resolve that problem. Now, I'm going to share with you what I do. And this is like the bad side of what I do. And I will tell you that if you talk to other network administrators, they'll tell you similar stories. You go through the steps, and you go through many of them. Trial and error, trial and error, trial and error, and you finally find the solution to the problem. And you think to yourself, that was such a pain, I will never forget that. Right? You're feeling so good, I solved that. It was a real pain, but I solved it. I'll never forget that. And then like 6 months goes by or a year goes by, and you don't have a problem like that ever again. And then suddenly it comes back, right? But after a long period of time. And you're going, aha, I remember seeing that. That was a year ago, but I solved it. And you know what happens? You go through that same series of steps because your brain is still working with the same logic it did the first time. When you finally, resolved it after, these 18 wrong ways of solving it, you finally got it down here, well, you do it again. Whereas if you had good documentation of what the problem was, what you went through, and how you solved it, when it comes back a year later, you just go right to your documentation and go, aha, that's how I solve it. Now, you're probably familiar with troubleshooting-based documentation. Most of us are. They're called knowledge-based articles, right? You have these knowledge bases. Okay? That's why those exist, to help with troubleshooting. Now, one last reason that I'll throw out there when it comes to documentation is reporting. Okay? Life as an IT professional can sometimes be a difficult one. And what I mean by that is, there's many different reasons we could say that it's a difficult one. I personally think it's a very fun life. That's why I do this. But the part that's difficult is sometimes truly being able to justify what you do and why you're important. Right? Because on a day-to-day basis, your job is not always the same. It's not like many other professions where you can have a literal punch list of this is what I come in and do every day. Your job depends on, what's going on with the network. What's going on? Is there something big? You're in the middle of a big project, Or maybe it's just keeping things running. And that's usually the real difficult spot, when you're just keeping things running, because it looks like you're doing nothing. You look like you're just sitting there with your feet up on the desk, relaxing, waiting for something to break. What a lot of people don't realize is how hard that we work to keep things running so that they're not breaking. So good documentation of everything that you do comes in real handy when it's review time. Okay, when your boss comes to you and says, you know, why are you important to this company? You go pull out that documentation and you go, this is why. And it won't be some like flimsy piece of paper like I'm pretending I have here. No, it'd be like this, this big, thick, dictionary of this is why I'm important. You write down everything that you've done. And I will tell you, many good IT administrators, what they will do is, even in a small company, they will implement some form of, call it maybe a ticket system, where anybody and everybody who wants anything done, no matter how big or small, they create some kind of a ticket so that there is documentation that you help them with a problem. All right, so like I said, documentation, not a whole lot of fun, but unfortunately, it's very important, so we have to do it. So the next question that you need to ask yourself is, what is it that I should be documenting? Right? If we're going to talk about it's important to document, that's all fine and dandy. But what should I document? You know what the answer is? The answer is everything. There is no one specific answer. You want to document and document and document. Now, some examples of what you might document are things like the hardware that you have, software that you're running, your network topology, wiring layouts, server configurations, network services, network procedures, policies, you name it. So again, that's not an all-encompassing list. That's just an example, but you really want to make sure that you have good, thorough documentation of just about anything and everything that you could think of. So the first specific item that I want to talk to you about when it comes to documentation is something called wiring schematics. Wiring schematics become increasingly important as a network grows. And as a matter of fact, I will tell you that not only do they become more important as the network grows, they become that much more difficult to create once your network grows. And for that reason, I'm going to strongly recommend that you create a wiring schematic no matter how small your network is. And the reason why is because no matter how small it is, it may grow someday. And if you wait until after it has grown to the point that you feel you need it, it also may have grown to the point that it's really difficult to do. Let me tell you from personal experience that that is the case. I will tell you that everything in this lesson that I'm going to talk to you about when it comes to documentation, I'll be perfectly honest with you and tell you that I am somewhat of a hypocrite in the sense that I don't mean to be, okay? So I'm not trying to intentionally put myself down, but I'm not the greatest when it comes to documentation. I've had to train myself to become much better at documentation. And a good example is, I've had a number of different network wiring plans that, I thought I wouldn't need one, and then the network grew, and then I did, and, then I had a long weekend to deal with. Now, when it comes to the detail of these wiring schematics, they need to be complex enough to thoroughly explain the entire network, while simple enough for a new administrator to understand. And that's a fine line. It's a real fine line between having it complex enough that you've got enough detail to truly explain what every detail of what you're trying to keep a record of, while at the same time simple enough that, I'll tell you what, it's not just new administrators, and I don't mean new as in new to computer networking, I even mean new to the company. Or I'm going to take it a step further, because again, personal experience, it needs to be simple enough that when you create this thing and then you put it away, right, you file it somewhere safe, and you come back a year later because you need to reference it, and then even though you drew it up in the first place, you forgot what you were looking at and have to kind of rethink through, now what did I mean by this and what did I mean by that? So it's a real fine line between making it complex enough yet simple enough to understand. Now, here is just a very, and I'll tell you what, there's not enough varies that I could put on this, on how basic a wiring scheme this is here. Okay, I mean, I'm giving you a real basic idea. This would be an example of what you do with a really small network, where you see here all we have our telephone line and how we're getting to the telephones themselves. And sometimes when you see a block like we have here that says telephone, that may mean, you know, the group of telephones. You don't necessarily have to list every single telephone. But then again, sometimes you do. So you got to take that all into consideration. Also, in this particular drawing, could mean that there's just a single telephone, right? This is some small office. I mean, notice it's an ADSL Ethernet router that's going on here, so we're just using DSL. This could be like my home office. If this was not, you know, just a single small home office, and if the telephone block, let's say, represented multiple telephones, you might actually put that in there. You know, put the number 10 representing there's 10 telephones that are all connected via that telephone line. Okay, just giving you hypotheticals here. This is not a real schematic. This is just an example. Again, I'm showing how you have the RJ45 crossover Ethernet cable. Okay, so I'm getting very specific to show that there's a cable between the Ethernet router and an Ethernet switch. Notice that the switch is specific to saying it's a 10100 switch, that the cable is a crossover cable. You'll see that from that switch, we branch out to 3 computers and a wireless access point. Now, you know what I don't have on here? I don't have anything that represents how many potential wireless clients maybe are connecting. But then again, maybe I don't need it because this is a wiring schematic, right? So these are all things you need to look at. And again, those 3 computers may not mean literally 3 computers. Maybe that's all I had room for on the paper, so I may want to write a number in there to express how many computers we're actually talking about. Now here is where we go beyond just the wiring schematic, and we get into a physical and logical network diagram. Okay, so we're going beyond the cabling. The lines that you see drawn on here don't really have to do with physical cables necessarily. Okay, they just represent some form of connection. And I will tell you that this is an actual network diagram for the way Train Signal had their office set up at one point in time. And I could say that I'm proud to say, or maybe I'm sorry to say, depending on your opinion of this particular diagram, that yes, I'm the one that created it. I used a program called Visio, Microsoft Visio, to create this. And this was when our office was still, as you can see, quite small. Okay, if you look at how many clients there were out there, there aren't many. And when our office was real small, I said, you know what? We're growing. And so I need to put something together. And what I had to do was put something together that I could follow along with, and anybody else who was helping me run the network could follow along with. And then we hired a full-time network administrator to go ahead and take over all of our networking duties here at Train Signal. And when I passed them over to him, I needed to be able to pass him a diagram to say, here's what the network looks like. And this was not the diagram I handed him. I will tell you that the network grew from here, but I grew this diagram with it and then gave him that diagram so that he knew what he was dealing with when we hired him. Now, the next thing that you're going to want to document this in many different areas of networking, and that is something called baselines. And when I say many different areas, I'm saying you want to do it at the computer level, you want to do it for bandwidth on a communication line, you want to do it on a specific server providing certain services. The idea of what these baselines are is these are performance readings on how things are working when they are at somewhere between, some will say, I have listed here optimal network performance, and in other cases people will say that a baseline is a reading of kind of entry-level network performance, meaning you just set everything up before you got fancy with it. Where's our performance at? Okay, whichever way you want to call it, it's pretty much the same idea. You set everything up, and before it gets completely crazy, and before you start having network issues, you create these baseline readings of how things are in the beginning. Then, when a problem arises, you can take those same performance readings and compare them against your baseline. And this will help you to troubleshoot what's going on. Okay, so an example would be if you took a baseline of network performance, but you didn't just say, well, how's the network performing? No, you actually look at many different characteristics of the network performance. Then you have people complaining that the network is slow. You take some more readings of those same characteristics of network performance and see which ones match to the original baseline readings and which ones are out of whack. Because when you see which characteristics suddenly have changed, well, now you know where your problem is. Now, this may not tell you the solution to your problem, but at least you know where your problem is, which is the beginning of solving or coming up with that solution. Another type of documentation that you should always have in place are network policies. These are policies that are used to establish rules and guidelines regarding network usage and conduct. Okay, so very often these are policies that you've probably seen before at some job that you went to. If they had technology at that particular job, you probably went to HR when you first got hired and you had to sign some document explaining that you understand the rules and guidelines about how you can use that technology. And it usually says things like you can't use technology for personal reasons. Okay, you're only supposed to be using it for business-related reasons. Sometimes it'll even go into detail, and I will tell you, more detail is better, right? Because then there's no gray area, you know, there's no fuzzy area. You got a full understanding, and the employees have full understanding of what they can and can't do. But they may say things like personal use can only be done on your lunch break or designated break times or with designated break computers or things like that. Very often you'll recognize this document because it'll say something like failure to comply with these policies is subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination. That's a common line that's been used in many of these documents. And one thing that I'm going to tell you about these policies that's really important that a lot of people don't think of. They'll establish these policies. Companies will establish a policy, and then every employee that they hire from that day forward will sign the policy. But the problem is that over time, the policy doesn't make sense anymore. And so people will violate the policy, and it'll be ignored. No one will be punished because, well, it just makes sense not to follow the policy anymore. That's not where you want to be. Because the problem is that when you have somebody who's truly abusing technology, you're not really able to enforce the policy because you're letting everyone else break the rules. So it's very important that you review and modify the policies as the network and the business needs change. Okay, so as your network changes, as the needs of the business change, as technology as a whole changes, you need to update and re-implement your network policies. Now, a few examples would be things like network usage, internet and email usage, and external software, when it comes to actually like installing software. These are three huge examples that are typically part of this policy. Now, besides the network policy, there's also the need for documentation of network procedures. Network procedures are used to establish how networking tasks are to be performed. And I will tell you that there's many procedures that a network administrator is responsible for. And I will tell you that some of these procedures, you'll love this. I'm going to be specific to one procedure. One procedure that needs to be documented is how to address a violation of network policy. Okay, so that's where these two kind of come together, where we talk about network policies and procedures. Very often, we'll talk about these one and the same, right? Network policies and procedures. Policies are specific to how the network can be used and how it should not be used. And procedures are specifically what network administration should be doing and how they should be doing it. And I'm not talking about a literal, like, day-to-day how you do your job. I mean certain specific procedures like addressing a violation or performing backup and recovery, right? A procedure for how we do backups and then a separate set of procedures for how do we recover based upon what type of loss we have. Okay, those are just a couple examples of specific procedures that should be documented. And I will tell you that this is another really good example of something that I can't express how easy it can make your life if you have this stuff documented, and at the same time, how rare it is that we actually have good documentation for network administration. I mean, because, you know, in the real world, the life of a network administrator is an ever-changing position, and because it's changing so often, very often the procedures get out of date very quickly, and therefore companies just choose not to document them at all, or then even the network administrators themselves don't bother documenting it because as soon as they finish, it's changed, and then they have to spend so much time just documenting the procedures that, well, they don't have enough time to do anything else. Not only that, but typically the network administrator's life is a very busy one. And so, again, you don't have a lot of time for this documentation. But I will tell you, your life may not be as busy if you have good documentation explaining exactly how to do things. And not only does this documentation explain how to do things, but it also documents where to go for certain things. Where is certain software maintained? Where is certain hardware stored? Who in the company should you go to when certain events happen? At what point do you notify outside authorities, whether it be the legal authorities, and when I say legal, I mean like lawyers, or whether it means outside authorities like the police. Okay, I know they're both kind of legal, but you can break that apart. So network procedures should also clearly be documented. All right, so before we bring this lesson to a close, I just want to kind of re-emphasize that it's really important to have all sorts of different types of documentation, whether it be wiring schematics, physical and logical network diagrams, detailed configuration document of different networking devices, cabling. But there's also one other thing that I want to put kind of a focus on. And I mentioned this once briefly, but you always want to keep change management in mind. Okay? In other words, when it comes to computer networking, or how about I just generically say when it comes to technology, it's always advancing. It always has, and it always will. And what that means is even though the business that you're in may not be changing very much, the technology surrounding it is changing. And so that's a real key to good documentation, is to make sure that you don't just document it and say, all right, done with that one. No, you document it and then you revisit that documentation as things change. So that does bring us to the end of this lesson. You now know that it's important to, I know you don't want to do it, I don't either, but you know it's important to document everything, and so I'll see you in the next lesson.